This is just a very quick follow-up to the last video I made, which was to do with ecopsychology. And I kind of ended that by talking about how for the health and functioning and optimal functioning, if you like, of the ecology, or the ecopsychology, if I can call it that, of the planet, there would have to be ethical choices made between individual human suffering and more kind of global awareness. You know, and there would be pretty severe ethical choices. Do we let this child die, or do we do something to preserve the environment? And we're kind of already making those choices. We just don't see them. They're embedded within the fabric of our cultural institutions and our the system of capital, I think, that we work with. But you know, that's undoubtedly going to continue. But one of the things I've just been thinking about in terms of things like non-duality, actually. It's going to get a bit woo-woo here, but never mind. In terms of things like meditation, spiritual practice, enlightenment, those kinds of ideas, which I have to say I still do think of as largely self-indulgent. And they might be pleasurable, they might give one a feeling of having special access to knowledge. But I think for the most part it is just a feeling, and as they say in AA, feelings aren't facts, they're just feelings. But that to one side for the moment. I think there is a sense in which those kinds of ideas could be seen as preparations for the kind of transformation to a way of living in which ecopsychology comes first. I mean, certainly a lot of those practices, I'm thinking of something like Buddhist practice, for example, and I'm not claiming to be any kind of an expert, but certainly the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, which underpins a lot of their practices, including their meditation practice, acknowledges suffering. In fact, it's the first Noble Truth, I think, that there is suffering. I think you also find that in kind of Christian mysticism as well, where there is this acknowledgement of suffering, couched in very different terms. But the purpose of Christian mysticism, for example, the contemplative practices within that, are about transcending the body, of coming out of the body and ignoring its suffering in some way, or trivializing its suffering, seeing its suffering as not being the most important thing. I think you also find that in lots of other spiritual and religious traditions, and to a certain extent in philosophy. I've talked before about Boethius writing about the consolations of philosophy, about how keeping one's mind focused on the big picture, if you like, asking oneself the big questions, identifying with the big questions, such that one, in a sense, becomes part of the big questions of existence, rather than simply embodying the small questions of individual human existence. How those can be consoling. And when Boethius wrote the Consolations of Philosophy, he was in a particularly life-threatening condition. My understanding is he was banged up awaiting execution. And so the consoling effect of that is to identify not with the individual autonomous human being in which one's consciousness appears to be lodged, but to take advantage of the fact that we have a kind of mobile and motile sense of consciousness, apply that to a wider understanding in ecopsychology, say, or spirituality, if you wanted to use those terms, and relegate individual humanity, individual human being, I should say, individual human suffering to a lower, give it a lower priority, really. And there's a kind of consolation in that. It doesn't bode well. I mean, it's not a pretty picture I'm drawing for myself here. I recognise that. And it probably opens the door to all kinds of weirdly fascist and totalitarian excesses. So I'll have to think more about that, certainly. But the idea of an ecopsychology, the idea that psychology, the psyche, is something that can be applied to various different levels within the system, strategically, and And whilst we habitually apply it to the level of the system of organisation, which is our own body, which probably produced it in the first place, it's possible to apply it to wider systems, and sometimes we might need to, even if it's at the expense of damage to those systems, which we are more used to inhabiting. Not sure if I've made any sense there at all. I'll listen to this later, and if it's nonsense, I'll try and write about it in the sidebar thing.